Hello, you're watching Sky News. It's 12 o'clock. We are waiting for Prime Minister's questions to begin very, very shortly. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, is with me here in the studio in Westminster. Beth, what should we be keeping our eye out for today?
Well, the difficulty in answering that question, Jane, is that, as we know, Kemi Badenoch kind of jumps from many different subjects, but there are some obvious issues for the government. The first is growth, the big agenda for Keir Starmer, and there's been some leaked reports from the Office of Budget Responsibility suggesting that this is the fiscal watchdog that sets the parameters for the government when they're doing their forecasting and setting budgets and spending reviews, and they have downgraded growth. So that could come up, and also immigration.
He's on his feet. Let's listen in.
We also announced a further £350 million to get Britain building and deliver 1.5 million new homes our country desperately needs, including more affordable homes. We've slashed red tape that holds businesses and working people back, creating 10,000 more apprentices. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was proud to have played my part in helping draft what has now become the Employment Rights Bill. A new poll shows 3/4 of the British public back the stronger rights for workers in the bill, including better sick pay. Yet that lot over there, the Tories and Reform, disgracefully voted against it. In fact, the leader of the opposition doesn't even believe in maternity pay or the living wage. Mr. Speaker, our statutory sick pay is ranked one of the lowest in Europe. It needs to be brought in line with the living wage. So will the Prime Minister back my campaign to strengthen this bill further so sick pay is at the level that finally stops punishing workers for being sick?
Mr. Speaker, our plan for change delivers the biggest upgrade in workers' rights in a generation to our employment rights bill. Ending exploitative zero-hour contracts, ending the scandal of fire and rehire, extending statutory sick pay to 1.3 million employees. Of course, that's on top of the pay rise for 3 million of the lowest paid. I would have thought the Leader of the Opposition might actually sort of support day one protection employment rights, given where she's going, but she thinks maternity leave is excessive. Our plan is pro-worker and pro-growth.
Yeah. Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government established the Ukraine Family Scheme, and in total, over 200,000 Ukrainians, mostly women, children and the elderly, have found sanctuary in the UK from Putin's war. However, a family of 6 from Gaza have applied to live in Britain using this scheme, and a judge has now ruled in their favour. This is not what the scheme was designed to do. This decision is completely wrong. It cannot be allowed to stand. Is the government planning to appeal on any points of law? And if so, which ones?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government, according to the legal framework of the last government. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer the question. If he plans to appeal, then the appeal may be unsuccessful and the law will need to be changed. And if he does not appeal, the law definitely will need to be changed. He talks about a decision made under the last government. It was not made by the last government, it was made by the courts. The issue we are discussing today is about judicial decisions. We cannot be in a situation where we allow enormous numbers of people to exploit our laws in this way. There are millions of people all around the world in terrible situations. We cannot help them all, and we certainly cannot bring them all here. Will he commit to bringing forward that new legislation or amending his Borders Bill?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already said the Home Secretary has already got her team working on closing this loophole. We don't need to wait for that. We're getting on with that because we're taking control. They lost control of immigration. We had nearly 1 million people come into this country, had an open borders experiment. On a Monday of this week, they voted against increased powers to deal with those that are running the vile trade of people smuggling. Same old Tories, open borders, empty promises.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister was on top of his brief, perhaps he'd be able to answer some questions. Given this crazy decision and so many others, new legislation is needed to clarify the right to a family life in Article 8. I'm not talking about what he just said. I know Labour MPs don't understand much of what they're saying, but the Prime Minister literally wrote a book on the European Convention on Human Rights. This is a situation where we need to put our national interest before the ECHR. Does he agree that we should legislate even if lawyers warn that this might be incompatible with human rights law?
She complains about scripted answers and questions. Her script doesn't allow her to listen to the answer.
Prime Minister.
She asked me if we're going to change the law and close the loophole in question 1. I said yes. She asked me again in question 2, and I said yes. She asked me again in question 3. It's still yes.
Mr. Speaker, he didn't listen to question 1. I asked if he would appeal the decision. He did not answer that. He's not listening. He's too busy defending the international human rights law framework. Mr. Speaker, this case has arisen because a Palestinian came to the UK from Gaza in 2007. He is now a British citizen. This is precisely why we need to break the conveyor belt from arriving in the UK to acquiring indefinite leave to remain, and then a British passport, and now a right to bring 6 family members here as well. Just last week, the Prime Minister bizarrely claimed that a British passport was not a pull factor for those coming to the UK. Will he now support our plans to toughen the process on indefinite leave to remain and make getting a British passport a privilege, not a right?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, they presided over record high levels of immigration. Reached nearly 1 million. It was a one-nation experiment in open borders. And she was the cheerleader. She was the one campaigning for more people to come and thanking her own side when they supported her campaign. So before she lectures us, I think she needs to reflect on her own record here.
Mr. Speaker, he is the Prime Minister now. The people out there want to know what he is going to do about the situation. He needs to spend less time whining about the last government and do his job. I thought, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister and I both agreed that Israel had a right to defend herself. Yet the judge in this case noted that the family were facing a humanitarian crisis, and I quote, as a consequence of the Israeli government's indiscriminate attempts to eliminate Hamas, and government lawyers accepted this. Is the Prime Minister allowing lawyers to change the position on Israel? And was this because of advice from the Attorney General? And if not, why on earth did government lawyers accept the argument that Israeli actions were indiscriminate?
Prime Minister.
They put the complete opposite argument. She talks about on top of her brief. She has no idea what she's talking about. I'll tell her again. We need to change the law. That's why the Home Secretary is already closing the gap. I know the script doesn't allow any adaptation, but this is getting tedious.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has not read the judgment. I suggest that he does. There are very serious questions now. Being asked about the Attorney General, the Prime Minister's personal friend and donor. Even Labour ministers are concerned. One Labour peer, Lord Glassman, has called him the absolute archetype of an arrogant progressive fool. Yeah. If we are serious about protecting our borders, we need to make sure we appoint people who believe in our country and everything we stand for. It is not clear the Attorney General does. The government is now recruiting a new Chief Inspector of Borders who lives in Finland and wants to work from home. This is not serious. Why should the British public put up with this?
Prime Minister.
The individual in question was appointed in 2019 by the last government to a senior position. He then worked for 5 years from Finland. We've changed that, and he's now going to be working from the United Kingdom full-time. Finland under them. And she talks about the Attorney General. She sat round the cabinet table with an attorney who was later sacked for breaching national security.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Long-standing traders in the CPS Centre in Colchester were devastated to receive eviction notices, giving them just 28 days to vacate, entirely out of the blue and under spurious pretexts by the new owner, shell company Shivat Hananim Capital. So far, the owner and their legal representatives have failed to hear tenants' concerns and mine and to negotiate a way forward. So does the Prime Minister share my concerns at this situation, and will he set out our plans to protect independent businesses which are at the heart of our high street and communities?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Well, thank her for raising this, which is obviously of real concern to businesses in her constituency. We do, Mr. Speaker, expect landlords to meet their obligations to make buildings safe, and we support robust enforcement action from the regulators if they fail to do so. I will make sure that she gets a meeting with the Minister to discuss what steps can be taken in the particular case to support the businesses that her constituents rely on.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 80 years ago this week, the Allies began a pincer movement against German forces between the Ruhr and the Rhine. British and Canadian troops attacked from the north, Americans from the south. British, Canadian and American soldiers fighting shoulder to defeat fascists. 80 years on, President Trump seems to have forgotten all this. His tariffs against steel and aluminium will hit Canada the hardest and will also hit jobs and the cost of living in our country. So in reminding President Trump who America's true and long-standing friends and allies really are, will the Prime Minister also prepare a plan for tariffs in return, starting with tariffs on American electric cars?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he's right to reference our history in the 80-year anniversary. And of course, we were fighting alongside the Americans, and that is amongst the reasons we have a special relationship. British steel is an essential part of our heartlands, and we will not abandon our skilled workforce. And it needs a level-headed assessment of the implications, which is what we're going through at the moment. But we will always put our national interest first and steelworkers first.
Sir Ed Davey.
Thank the Prime Minister for that reply, but it seems to me the way President Trump and his ally Musk are operating, they do need to hear strong measures and words from even their allies. And moving on to Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, if Ukraine is forced to surrender its own sovereign territory to Russia, it will be the greatest betrayal of a European ally since Poland in 1945. But President Trump says Ukraine may end up Russian, and he wants American money back. I think we all fear where this could end and the dangerous implications for our defence and our security. So can the Prime Minister reassure this House that he and other European leaders have given sufficient support to President Zelensky so that he can't be bullied by Trump and Putin into accepting a deal that will effectively hand victory to Russia?
Prime Minister.
As he knows, I met President Zelensky in Kyiv just a few weeks ago. It was my 8th meeting. The position since the outbreak of this conflict has been a united position across the House of supporting Ukraine, and I was able to reiterate my position, which is we must put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That matters now just as much as it mattered at the beginning of this conflict, the strongest possible position, and I did discuss with him what more we can do, what more our allies can do to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position.
Kim Ledbeach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, from the benches opposite, I published my Healthy Britain report, recommending a cross-departmental approach to improving health and wellbeing. Now that we're in government, I'm delighted that ministers have hit the ground running, because running is obviously very healthy for you. So will the Prime Minister confirm that last week's announcement of an increase to the public health grants, which will help local services focus more on prevention and early intervention, is just the start of a long-term strategy that will make Britain healthier, happier and more productive, reduce pressure on the NHS and promote growth?
Well, I thank her for highlighting the important role that local communities play in supporting healthy lifestyles. I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, we're providing almost £4 billion for the local health services that people rely on, and that's things like health visitors, stop smoking services and drug abuse treatments. I'll make sure that she meets the relevant minister to discuss.
Saoirse Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I get it. Nobody wants to get into a trade war. But, you know, unlike Peter Mandelson, sometimes you've got to stand up for what you believe in. My friends here in the DUP have learnt nothing from their mistake of backing Brexit and think that tariffs are a laughing matter. No. But would you agree with me that actually we need to stand up for ourselves, we need to back our workers, we need to back our businesses, not just in Lagan Valley, but indeed across the UK?
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. The US and the UK share a strong and balanced trading relationship. We invest hugely in each other's economies, and we will continue to work closely with President Trump to boost growth and to create jobs. And I reassure her we will always act in the best interests of businesses and working people across the whole of the United Kingdom, including, of course, Northern Ireland.
Lynn Corgill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was baffled on Monday that, given the chance to support legislation backed by the National Crime Agency to crack down on criminal smuggler gangs and secure our borders, the parties opposite, the Conservatives and Reform, linked arms in the voting lobby to vote against it. The Conservatives spent 3 years and £700 million on their ludicrous Rwanda scheme and saw 4 volunteers returned. Does the Prime Minister agree with me? There is only one party that is serious about repairing our broken immigration system.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and let me remind them what they voted against earlier this week in our Borders Bill. They voted against, that's Reform and the Tories, they voted against making it an offence to organise the buying, selling and transport of small boats, against making it an offence to endanger lives at sea, against and powers to arrest suspected people smugglers before the smuggling takes place. They voted against. They voted for open borders, both of them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Prime Minister gave yet another threadbare excuse for why he and his North London lawyer friends are giving away the Chagos Islands. Mr. Speaker, this is his decision, and he must own it. More importantly, he can't tell us, the British taxpayer, how much this is going to cost. Is it £9 billion? Is it £18 billion? Is it £52 billion? The Times have called this botched deal insane. Members of his own cabinet reportedly think it's impossible to understand. And one of his own MPs think it's the worst thing the Labour Party have ever done. So could the Prime Minister tell us which word he thinks best describes this deal?
Mr. Speaker, I set out the position in relation to Chagos Islands last week. I also offered the Leader of the Opposition a briefing on this, a high-level briefing. She still hasn't taken me up on that briefing. They're asking questions without wanting to know the facts. It's extraordinary. Mr. Speaker, someone who wants to be Prime Minister does not want to know the facts, even when she's offered a high-level briefing. He'd be better informed if she took me up on the offer of a briefing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will, I'm sure, want to congratulate Newcastle United on reaching the League Cup final after Arsenal's exit. But will he also, in what is National Apprentice Week, will he also congratulate the 600 apprentices learning trades from welding to quantity surveying as part of the Tyne Bridge restoration programme? And whilst I know he can't confirm bridging the funding gap left by the Tories, will he confirm that he is looking forward to seeing the Tyne Bridge restored in time for its 100th birthday in 2028?
Well, look, I'm going to struggle to sound delighted with the results of that particular football match, but look, it will be a special day for Newcastle fans. But the Tyne Bridge is an iconic northeast landmark, and I congratulate the apprentices who are helping to restore this vital piece of infrastructure. As usual, the Tories made empty promises that they had no intention of keeping, including £2.9 billion worth of transport commitments that were never funded. We will look at the capital projects around the spending review and let her know as soon as we can.
Liz Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, Peter and Maureen, have been married for 70 years. Peter is 93, and for the past few weeks he has been stuck on a hospital ward waiting to go home because a care package hasn't been arranged. Peter is missing home and missing Maureen. So will the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that the social care crisis will be tackled this year?
Well, can I thank her for raising this issue and the particular case of her constituents? And I also know this is deeply personal to her, and if I may, I extend my deepest sympathies to her and her family for their loss. We have taken immediate action on social care, already delivered £3.7 billion of additional investment, working on the first ever fair pay agreement for the sector and, of course, boosting the carers allowance. I invite her and everybody to work with the House on the longer-term reform that we need. Thank you.
Julie Mims.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. James Rennie is an outstanding specialist school in the heart of my Carlisle constituency. Having converted every spare corner into classrooms, exceeded its published admissions numbers, and already having 43 applications known for this September, it is literally bursting at the seams. It cannot expand any further, and what is clearly needed is a new specialist school for North Cumbria. What assurances can the Prime Minister give my constituents that his government will put children before ideology and allow local authorities to tackle the shortage in SEND provision?
Well, I thank her for raising this vital issue. It's not the first time it's come up. We are supporting mainstream schools to increase SEND expertise whilst also establishing dedicated SEN units. Because we need to make sure that special schools also can cater for those with the most complex needs. So we're working on this. It's come up time and again, but we are doing that vital initial steps.
Sabine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dorothy House is an amazing hospice that supports terminally ill people in Frumen East Somerset and their families, including my good friend Lisa. Next year, Dorothy House will be looking forward to celebrating 50 years of service, but they will also be facing an additional cost of £422,000 thanks to increases in employers' national insurance. Will the Prime Minister commit to meeting with me and representatives of the hospice sector to hear firsthand the impact of NICs and to work with them to find a solution?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, everyone deserves high quality and compassionate end-of-life care. The honourable member knows we inherited a £22 billion black hole in our public finances. That's why we took the difficult but right decisions to invest in our public services. I do recognise the pressure that hospices are facing, and that's why we invested £100 million into hospitals, with an additional £26 million to support children and young people's hospices. And I will make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
John Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A significant part of the dreadful legacy left by the previous Conservative government is a chronic underfunding of transport infrastructure, especially in the North East, as we've just heard from my honourable friend. So does the Prime Minister agree with me and the North East Mayor Kim McGuinness that redevelopment of the Leam sideline, the disused Leam sideline, that would reconnect Gateshead with North Durham North, and increasing the capacity on the East Coast Main Line would help bring the metro to Washington in my constituency, and would bring much needed jobs, growth and opportunities to my region?
Well, I thank her, and both she and the North East Mayor are dedicated campaigners on this issue. The party opposite left us a host of unfunded promises, and public transport is in dire condition. Expanding the metro network has huge potential to drive growth and unlock new housing. I'm pleased that progress is being made on the business case.
Second Batty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, we learned that the Prime Minister's close friend, the Attorney General, has in the past advised Caribbean nations on seeking trillions of pounds in reparations. He's been a key player in the surrender of the Chagos Islands and the related fiasco there, which will cost the taxpayers up to £18 billion, and has even advised Jerry Adams, who is standing in line to get compensation from the British government in Northern Ireland legacy payments, the quantum of which could cost up to £2.7 billion. Given the Attorney General's track record, does the Prime Minister have faith in his motives, and does he have confidence that his best friend represents good value for the British taxpayer?
Mr. Speaker, we've long had the principle that everybody's entitled to legal representation in this country. That means that lawyers don't necessarily agree with their client. Now, the Conservative Party used to believe in that principle. If they now disagree with that principle, they should go and see the victims of very serious crime, including sexual crime, and tell them that under their provisions, the lawyer who disagreed with the perpetrator wouldn't be able to represent them, meaning that victims will be cross-examined by perpetrators because lawyers disagree with the perpetrator. That's never been the Conservative Party position. If it is now, they should say so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Allergy School, launched just this week by the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, is a free programme to support children with food allergies. Allergic disease is a growing issue in this country, with over 20 million people in the UK being affected. For this reason, it has never been more important for us to have a national allergy strategy and an allergy czar to drive and coordinate that action. Will the Prime Minister join me in welcoming this programme, and will he meet with me and the Foundation to talk about how we can work together to drive this issue forward?
Well, I thank her for raising this really important issue, because hospital admissions for allergies have risen sharply, particularly in the last 2 decades. I do welcome the work being carried out by the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation. We will respond to the recommendations of the National Allergy Strategy Group in due course, and I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Oxfordshire constituency of Didcot and Wantage has seen a 35% population increase in the last 20 years. My constituents recognise the need for affordable housing, but the current planning system isn't delivering the GP surgeries, dentists and transport options that they need. Will the Prime Minister restore faith in the planning system and, as well as focusing on housing numbers, deliver the local targets for health services and wider infrastructure that growing communities need?
Well, thank you for his question. We are, of course, delivering the 1.5 million homes, but we're creating communities as well for the future, and so he's right that that must include good schools, GPs and reliable transport links. That's what makes a good community. And just today, Mr. Speaker, we announced an additional £350 million to deliver more affordable homes so more people can realise the dream of home ownership.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week is National Apprenticeship Week. As co-chair of the APPG for Apprenticeships, I can tell the Prime Minister Speaker, that employers are very pleased to see the announcements this week that will make a real difference both in terms of the completion rate and the flexibility around apprenticeships. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that schools should be promoting apprenticeship alongside A-levels and other options? And can he tell us what more he's going to do to support more young people to get into an apprenticeship?
I'm very pleased that he's raised this issue and that we'll be able to give employers more flexibility over maths and English requirements. This is really important, Mr. Speaker. There are very many young people who didn't get the maths qualification they wanted at the time, but are very well suited for the future, want to play their part, and now they can get apprenticeships under the changes that we've made. And that's 10,000 extra apprenticeships. This is delivering for them, giving them a chance for the future to contributing, of course, to our economy.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Farming Minister told a conference of farmers that farming is not high in the pecking order for this government. Given the heartless family farm tax, is his minister correct? Yes or no?
Farming's top of the agenda, as far as I'm concerned. That's why we put £5 billion to support farmers in the budget. They failed to spend £300 million on their watch on farming, and we set out our roadmap, which has been welcomed by the NFU, as she very well knows. It was described as long overdue. I wonder who didn't do it before.
Mr. Jewett, I'm sure you don't want to be leaving today. It's not the best day. Right. Natasha Irons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a graduate of the Croydon Youth Philharmonic Orchestra, the Prime Minister will know that youth services can broaden a young person's horizons beyond what they could ever imagine. But with national spending on youth services seeing a 73% decline since 2010, can the Prime Minister outline how this government will bring youth services back into our communities? Will he look at giving them the statutory protections they deserve? And will he visit Croydon East to see firsthand the vital role these services play in my constituency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my days in the Croydon Youth Philharmonic Orchestra were a long time ago now. But we do fully recognise the importance of youth services to help young people save lives and live safe and healthy lives. We've been developing our plans for the new National Youth Strategy to bring power back to young people and help every young person realise their potential.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Every 22 minutes, a child in this country loses a parent or a loved one. That's 40,000 children every year facing a trauma which many of us here know can last a lifetime. Charities such as Winston's Wish do a fantastic job of providing support for young people, particularly when schools are closed or there's no one else to turn to. But at the moment, there's no simple way of the children knowing where the charities are or the charities being able to contact the children. So will the government back my private member's bill this summer to do just that? And would the Prime Minister meet me to discuss how we make sure that another generation of children does not have to face this trauma?
Well, can I thank her for her ongoing work and campaign on this important issue. The Cross-Government Bereavement Group continues to look at how we can improve access to the support that children and young people need at these difficult times. And of course, I'll make sure that she gets the meeting that she wants with the Minister to discuss this further.
David Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday marks the 20th anniversary of the launch of the Make Poverty History campaign, and a fantastic speech for all of us that were there, delivered by the late, great Mandiba. That campaign inspired a generation of campaigners and a great Labour government to deliver unprecedented action to tackle global poverty, lifting millions out of poverty. Will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to some of those campaigners and commit to doing all he can to ensure that Britain is playing its full part in helping eradicate global poverty today?
It's a really important issue. We do pay tribute, and of course we continue to play our full part.
Alex Bloor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Basingstoke Hospital, used by half of my constituency of North East Hampshire, has had its rebuild delayed by 15 years, despite no ministerial visit to see the worsening conditions there. The cost of maintaining the hospital for those 15 years is estimated to be almost as much as the rebuild itself. So can the Prime Minister explain the logic of making taxpayers pay twice?
Mr. Speaker, her constituents are right to be frustrated about the empty, unfunded promises that were left behind by the Conservatives, a point made by her and, of course, by the Labour MP for Basingstoke. Under the previous government's plan, a new hospital in Basingstoke would simply not have been delivered because it was unfunded. It was a promise without anything behind it. We've put in place a funded deliverable plan which will see the hospital built, and we'll work closely with the Trust to ensure that it is.
Dr Becky Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government's devolution plans are a welcome progressive development to shift power and resources from Whitehall to our communities. But there are, of course, discussions now around the process and realisation of benefits for our communities. So can the Prime Minister assure my residents in Worthing West, and indeed all constituencies starting priority devolution programmes, that Sussex devolution will give us meaningful control over our local priorities, including housing, transport and social care?
Minister. Well, I thank her for raising devolution, which will see her constituents in Sussex get meaningful control over local priorities. The devolution priority programme, Mr Speaker, will see a wave of mayors elected next year, including in Sussex, and I believe that those with skin in the game make the best decisions about their communities.
Final question, Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister will be well aware of the Global Vaccination Fund, Gavi, one of the United Kingdom's great success stories. It's vaccinated from deadly diseases over 1 billion children under 5. It presents real value for money to British taxpayers, and over 80% of our constituents support it. Will he give the House today an undertaking that Britain will continue this leadership and make a decisive pledge at next month's replenishment conference?
Well, I'm grateful that this is a really important issue. As he rightly points out, I've long supported it and will continue to support and share details with him just as soon as I can. But it is important, have supported it, will continue to do so. Thank you.
Right, that completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, that was Prime Minister's questions. As has become the pattern now, Kemi Badenoch chose to go on one subject repeatedly throughout the 6 questions that she gets. Let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby, who's here. And Beth, she chose to go on these reports about a family from Gaza who've been able to use the Ukraine Family Resettlement Scheme.
Yeah, this is a story about, as you said, a family that has got a court judgment allowing them to remain in the UK. They're from Gaza under the Ukrainian scheme. And Kemi Badenoch came out of the blocks on this subject. The problem that she had was the Prime Minister had a very robust answer to it. So she challenged him on the scheme. And the Prime Minister, now talking very tough on immigration, basically answered, I don't agree with the decision, and we're going to now get the Home Secretary to look at closing the loophole. The issue, I think, then, for Kemi Badenoch was she kind of kept going back to the issue about the scheme. Now, she moved it actually to, are you going to try and appeal the decision, which he didn't answer that question, that is true. But I think the kind of first initial, very robust response from him kind of blunted that attack to the point that he began to goad her about it.
Let's listen to one of those exchanges.
The Prime Minister literally wrote a book on the European Convention on Human Rights. This is a situation where we need to put our national interest before the ECHR. Does he agree that we should legislate even if lawyers warn that this might be incompatible with human rights law?
She complains about scripted answers and questions. Her script doesn't allow her to listen to the answer.
Prime Minister.
She asked me if we're going to change the law and close the loophole in question 1. I said yes. She asked me again in question 2, and I said yes. She asked me again in question 3. It's still yes.
Well, there you have it.
I mean, her team have actually messaged me and made the point that she was asking about the appeal. Would they appeal? Would the government appeal the court decision? He said it was actually a decision made by the courts under the previous government, but that didn't answer the question. So she did have a point, but the problem was
it's sort of getting lost in the weeds a bit,
isn't it? It got lost in the weeds, and what she might have expected was the Prime Minister to be a little bit slippery on the scheme, but he wasn't. He was really robust. He said, I don't agree with it, we're going to close the loophole. And at that point, she didn't then pivot to something else. So it appeared that she got a bit stuck. And then you saw the way in which he kind of knocked her about a bit metaphorically in the chamber over that. So I don't think it was entirely a comfortable PMQs for her. She then also referenced a front-page story in the Mail saying that the new border inspector chief, or the guy they want to be that inspector, is in Finland. And then again, the Prime Minister said, actually, he was in Finland living there under the previous government. We're bringing him back to the UK. So again, an awkward exchange for her.
And it slightly left it to the Lib Dems to broaden out PMQs and to bring in other international issues. Ed Davey brought up Trump.
Favourite subject.
Yeah, President Trump. You know, as the US Defence Secretary is meeting NATO allies today, he brought that up. Let's just listen to his question.
If Ukraine is forced to surrender its own sovereign territory to Russia, it will be the greatest betrayal of a European ally since Poland in 1945. But President Trump says Ukraine may end up Russian, and he wants American money back. I think we all fear where this could end and the dangerous implications for our defence and our security. So can the Prime Minister reassure this House that he and other European leaders have given sufficient support to President Zelensky so that he can't be bullied by Trump and Putin into accepting a deal that will effectively hand victory to Russia?
Prime Minister. As he knows, I met President Zelensky in Kyiv just a few weeks ago at my 8th meeting. The position since the outbreak of this conflict has been a united position across the House of supporting Ukraine, and I was able to reiterate my position, which is we must put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That matters now just as much as it mattered at the beginning of this conflict, the strongest possible position, and I did discuss with him what more we can do, what more our allies can do to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position.
I mean, this is so interesting, Jane, because Ed Davey now brings up Trump pretty much at every Prime Minister's questions. Why? Because politically, Ed Davey sees that probably appeals to Lib Dem voters and maybe to Labour voters that would like the Prime Minister to be more robust in his language around the politics, if you like, of what Trump talks about and the language he uses and the decisions he takes. And what you've got is a Prime Minister that on policy terms might stick to the line, the government line and his position. So when Trump talked about permanent relocation of Palestinians, the Prime Minister last week, he stuck to the government line, but he does not want to go toe-to-toe in any criticism publicly of Trump because he thinks that will damage relationships. And so Ed Davey there's playing into that. I think on the substance of Ukraine, the new Defence Secretary is over, as you're saying, in NATO. There are clearly peace talks, or what the contours of that looks like. President Trump has said he wants the peace negotiations to be done in the first 100 days of his premiership. I think we're 24 days in. It feels a lot longer, doesn't it? A lot has happened. But the Prime Minister there is reiterating the line, and this is what they've been talking about peace through strength. The question is about where do they freeze the borders, what kind of peacekeeping force should there be? The Prime Minister, I was on that trip in Ukraine, he all but said to me that there could be UK troops on the ground in that peacekeeping force and what the contours of that deal are. But Davey there sees an opportunity to put some blue water, if you like, between him and the Labour Party when it comes to criticising or calling out Trump.
And as we just saw from those flags, that's the NATO headquarters in Brussels. There's going to be a press conference from there a little bit later with the UK Defence Secretary and the US as well, so we'll bring you that live. Well, it's a good opportunity now to bring in our panel of MPs. We've got the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight East, Joe Robertson, the Labour MP for Dover and Deal, Mike Tapp, and also the Liberal Democrat MP for Surrey Heath, Al Pinkerton, joining us in the studio. Been listening to Prime Minister's questions. Thank you all so much. Well, Joe, let's come to you for the Conservatives. First of all, quite a bit of criticism, not just from Beth of Kemi Badenoch, but quite a lot on X, Twitter, since Prime Minister's questions as well. She seems to get slightly stuck on her script.
Well, she was tapping into a major weakness with the Labour government, which is over immigration. and there is an unanswered question that came out of that, is if the Prime Minister doesn't agree with Gazans getting access to the UK through a Ukrainian scheme, will he appeal this decision in court? We have a court process there to appeal it. He's got to do that, and he didn't answer that question.
But the Prime Minister said very, very clearly that the Home Secretary was intervening. He didn't agree with the decision and pointed out that actually this happened under a Conservative government.
So the case may have started under a Conservative government, but the appeal is done through the Home Office, and it needs to now take it to the appeal, through the appeal process, as well as looking for changes in the law. But I think this is a much bigger picture on immigration, and the government road testing a few weak policies, which it's done this week, is not a solution to the immigration problem we have in this country, and it's not going to hoodwink the public.
Mike, I mean, the Conservatives are clearly going on immigration because they think it's a key issue for many, many voters, and it certainly is. And we've seen polls showing Reform doing very well this week as well. Does the Prime Minister have the right answers?
Well, it's utter madness that they'd go on immigration. They're clueless on the topic. They left us with open borders on illegal migration, up to 1 million on legal migration, and this sort of loophole to be exploited. Keir was clear, we're going to close that loophole. The bill that we put through the other day empowers the Border Security Command to bring in counter-terror powers, which is vital for taking on the smuggling gangs, and we've committed to bringing down legal migration in line with the jobs market. So it's absurd that she's attacking on this, to be quite honest.
Al, do you feel that the shift in policy that we've seen on immigration since the Labour Party have got into power is going to make a difference?
I think so much of course, what the Conservatives did was hugely performative and didn't actually lead to any improvement in our immigration situation. And I think there is a risk that in announcing, for example, that Labour are going to kind of scrap the ability of those who arrive in the UK informally to achieve citizenship, I think that's actually rather performative as well. I don't think that is actually going to solve in any way the immigration crisis. I mean, I think what I find most striking about today's performance was something that Beth pointed out, which was Keir Starmer gave an incredibly robust, very straightforward response, probably the most straightforward response I've heard from him since I've been sitting in the House of Commons as an MP. And yet Kemi Badenoch found it impossible to then alter her second question. She felt like a kind of Commodore 64 in a quantum computing world. She's just unable to reprogram herself to think about the next question of what it might be.
Joe, I mean, is she a Commodore 64 in a modern digital world?
I'm not quite sure what my colleague here is talking about. Look, I think there's a really serious point on immigration. I accept the last Conservative government didn't do enough on immigration. I accept that. The Labour government have had years to prepare for a problem it knows is difficult to tackle. It's been difficult for our neighbouring countries to tackle, and it has absolutely no idea what to do. It's coming out with these weak ideas, a bill that went through Parliament earlier this week that makes it a little bit more criminal to leave someone in the water than before, as though this is a deterrent. The smuggling gangs are not, selling Britain with all the caveats that the Labour government are trying to bring in through law. They're smuggling gangs. They're criminals. You're not going to win this on small, incremental ideas. Some of that mistake was made by the last government. This is a government without any ideas and without any appetite, frankly, to change it.
Joe, interesting though, were you surprised at how robust the PM's response was to that opening question? Because I was a bit surprised. He was really clear. Did that surprise you?
I have to say, I came into the studio while Kemi was on her third question, so I missed it. But he can talk tough. He can talk tough, and I'm sure he wants to talk tough. But the British public are really, really weary now on immigration. They want to see action, not tough words.
But they're weary, aren't they, because of the previous Conservative government, not because of the...
And I've accepted that, but that's not an excuse for the current government, which got elected to do things for doing nothing or not doing enough. I accept that. I'm not making an excuse for the previous government on immigration. That's not an excuse for this government to do nothing, talk tough and do nothing.
Mike, is that what the Labour government's doing? It's talking tough and doing nothing?
Look, we inherited, open borders, 400 in 2018 crossed, 150,000 since. That's purely on the Conservative watch. I'm not surprised at all that Keir's talking tough in response to that question and on immigration. We've set up the Border Security Command, but those powers, those counter-terror powers, are really important. And let me just explain why, in case you're not fully understanding it. It means that we can get to these smugglers before charge, so we can disrupt their activity, we can seize their assets, we can ensure that they can't speak to certain people, we can search, we can stop them at port. This is what we do to terrorists. We don't wait for terrorists to conduct attacks, and we won't wait for smugglers to put people in danger in the Channel. These are really important.
On the beaches of France?
Absolutely not. This is domestic terrorism. This is what I mean. You don't understand it. You weren't going to vote against it until you were dragged through the chamber.
They're being smuggled from the French coast.
You don't understand it. You weren't going to vote against it until Reform dragged you through the chamber. Read it.
No, sorry. I don't think the British public
are hoodwinked by this. I've worked in counter-terrorism. I've worked for the National Crime Agency, and I can vouch for these powers making a massive impact and empowering the National Crime Agency to sort this out.
We need to bring the gangs abroad. Stop and search on the streets of the UK is not going to make any difference whatsoever.
And if you don't mind, that is a part of this as well. We're forming those international relationships with the French, the Germans, the Iraqis. The Germans have changed their laws through pressure from Keir Starmer. That's great diplomacy.
Well, I'm glad he's improving the German immigration system.
We're also bringing in sanctions through the Foreign Office as well. So it's really good stuff.
Clearly, immigration is a hugely important, probably one of the top 3 issues for the public. It's true, too, that Keir Starmer, when he did his five targets by which the public could measure him, there wasn't a promise on immigration.
Actually,
there is a pledge to cut immigration. There isn't a target for stopping illegal crossings. And there was no targets for what he wanted to bring legal migration down by. So, in a way, the public could be forgiven for thinking he's saying a lot of stuff, but we've got nothing to measure him against, and he hasn't actually committed to any hard targets.
So if you're referring to the speech before Christmas, he laid out the milestones. Before that, he said that a foundation of that is secure borders and national security. So he's putting that as a top priority. He's saying we can't make any of these other milestones without these being taken seriously. So it's a top priority. That's why this bill is so important. It's great to have it through second reading, and I'm excited to see the Border Security Command, the National Crime Agency and MI5 empowered to use that.
Let me put it another way. Would you have liked a clearer target so the public would feel that this was a top priority?
We will bring down small boat crossings significantly over the next parliamentary term. We've got open borders. There's no magic wand to fix this. There's no silver bullet. It does take time, and there's lots of measures to be brought in to combat this.
Mike, you seem like a nice guy, but people will be shouting at the television screens hearing this. I mean, it's just not going to cut it. It's just not going to bring down migration.
The people that I've spoken to in Dover, on the doors, like this policy because they see we're taking it seriously, unlike the previous government.
I think people in Dover will be shouting.
Go on, interject. Break them up before we get to fisticuffs.
Listen, I mean, I think none of this is simple. We have a global displacement crisis. We do have the Conservative Party, who undoubtedly broke the previous immigration system. They have allowed people to languish on waiting lists, waiting to be processed, broken the court system. What we need to do is fairly straightforward. We need to process people more quickly, make decisions, and if they qualify to be here because they are official refugees, then they should be allowed to work and they should be working in the economy and contributing. And even when they're being processed, they could be working because that's what they want to do, costing the taxpayer less. But instead, they're left languishing, unworking and becoming, frankly, kind of more unwell as a consequence. And the British public are frustrated by that.
May I come in on that very briefly? We've deported 16,400. That's more than the Conservative managed in a year. That's in 6 months. And that's because we've got the process working. Those in the Home Office are doing that day job. We've got more decision makers in there, so we're getting those decisions made. That's really important so we can deport those who shouldn't be here and, of course, help those that need it.
Joe, let's just go back to you. Kemi Badenoch, it was her first 100 days this week. How are you feeling that she's doing?
A solid start. She's got the toughest job in politics. Nobody has
Not tougher
done
than being
this.
Prime Minister.
It's the toughest job when you come out of an election defeat, biggest defeat in 2 centuries, and she has to bring a party together and restore trust with the public. But she's not in government, so there's no immediate mechanism for doing that. And she's also got a really important constitutional role, which is to hold the government to account. The only person who's ever had that job before was William Hague, obviously, when we came out of 1997. So I think she's made a really solid start. It was also 50 years ago yesterday that Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party. she struggled in her first few years, and some commentators were saying 6 months in that she might not even make an election. That's Margaret Thatcher. Look what happened. Kemi's had a better start than Margaret Thatcher, so who knows?
Who knows indeed. Al, let's come back to you. We were pointing out that it's fallen to Ed Davey to bring up other subjects that lots of people are interested in, the UK's relationship with Trump and also what's happening in Ukraine. Where do you fear we are going on Ukraine?
Well, listen, as a kind of former academic in the realm of geopolitics, I'm so glad that Ed Davey is talking about the foreign scene and that we're not kind of being dragged into kind of domestic matters all the time. I am really worried about what's happening in Ukraine, and particularly because of what's happening in the US. The US, frankly, attacking its closest allies, whether that be Canada or Denmark over Greenland, attacking organisations like the International Criminal Court. The people that empowers are sitting in Moscow right now. They will be rubbing their hands in glee, thinking that the international rules-based order is breaking down and they will be able to exploit that. And I'm so glad that Ed Davey does talk about Donald Trump as a global bully. And frankly, this is beyond just politics, which is something that Beth pointed out. This is a geopolitical issue. A bully, like Donald Trump is, may be turning his attention on Canada and Panama and various others right now, and Denmark. But you can only cower in the shadows for so long before that bully will turn his attention onto you as well. And I do think that Britain needs to be more robust. I think we have a choice to make. Do we want to be hefted to a capricious president for the next 4 years who could, quite frankly, at any point place tariffs on us if he doesn't like what we're saying or doing?
But Al, do you think it's sensible for a Prime Minister that has to deal with President Trump on Ukraine, on the Middle East, on tariffs? Do you think it's sensible for a Prime Minister to sort of stand up and call President Trump a global bully, for example? Because Ed Davey's almost trying to goad him into this or call him out for not using this sort of language.
I'm not sure
but do you understand why a Prime Minister wouldn't do that?
I can understand why the Prime Minister would want to moderate his particular language, and maybe a Prime Minister wouldn't use a term like bully. But I think when you are dealing with somebody like Donald Trump, then I think there is a particular argument to be made, which does go against usual diplomatic thinking, to be much more robust in your response. And I think that's what Ed Davey is almost giving Keir Starmer permission to do. So by Ed Davey calling out Donald Trump as a bully, I think he's actually creating the space for Keir Starmer to be much more robust in the UK's response, which is, frankly, which I think we should be doing anyway.
Mike, Keir Starmer's still waiting for an invite from President Trump, isn't he?
They've obviously met before, and that will come soon. But I've got a lot of respect for the victory that Donald Trump achieved, bringing up that voter share across every demographic bar one, I believe. And look, we're going to have to work with the United States. They are our closest ally, and the relationship is strong. And going forward, I've no doubt that we can work together on trade, on AI, on tech, on defence, on intelligence sharing, just as we have in the past.
Joe, are you worried about President Trump in as much as that he seems to be quite friendly with Nigel Farage, not quite so close to Kemi Badenoch?
I think we've got to remember with Donald Trump, he's the democratically elected president of our closest ally, and that is an enduring relationship. This idea that the Prime Minister, regardless of his political colours, should be calling out the President of the United States as a bully, even in diplomatic language, is not in our national interest. We have to work with Donald Trump. He has a unique political style, and very often he rows back or changes course. So we've just got to work with the political reality of that.
Joe Robertson for the Conservatives, Mike Tapp for Labour and Al Pinkerton for the Lib Dems. Thank you so much. And Beth, our political editor. Lots more to come on Sky News. Stay with us after this short break.